Welcome back to another episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and today I have a very special treat as we have two guests on the show. First, we have Sarah Fay, who is an award-winning author and mental health advocate working to improve how we think and talk about our mental health by moving the conversation away from simplistic diagnoses and toward a deeper understanding of our mental and emotional lives. Her personal experience of being diagnosed with 6 different mental health disorders and finding no relief led her to investigate the diagnoses that we receive and to write her journalistic memoir, Pathological, The True Story of 6 Misdiagnoses, which Apple Books chose as one of the best books in March. Joining her to unpack a lot of this and more is Dr. Thomas Insel, who's a psychiatrist and neuroscientist who has been a national leader in mental health research, policy, and technology. From 2002 to 2015, Dr. Insel served as director of the National Institute of Mental Health. So let's get this conversation going and welcome Sarah Fay and Dr. Thomas Insel to the Adversity Advantage podcast. Dr. Insel and Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Doug. And call me Tom, please.
All right, Tom it is. So I'm really excited to have you both on the podcast. Sarah, I know you have quite the story in your own journey with mental health and the DSM and the misdiagnoses and how you've come out on the other side and wrote this book, Pathological, to help give other people hope if they're going through the same sort of struggle that you went through. And Tom, obviously, your work in the field of mental health has been so instrumental, being the director of the National Institute of Mental Health for nearly, 15 years. And I'm so excited to have this conversation because it's 2022. There's been so much innovation, so much conversation, education, research, schooling on mental health. Yet I often feel that the issue seems to be getting worse and not better. So Tom, if you could maybe encapsulate it the best you can as to why you think we are where we are right now.
Well, hey, Doug, I'm delighted to be here and really excited to do this with Sarah. Her book is, as you mentioned, fantastic. It's a really great journey. And so it's fun to do this together. What you just said is actually what got me to write the book Healing, because I couldn't figure out why with so much progress in the science, so many options, more people getting care than ever before. And when you talk to individual providers, they feel like they're doing better than ever before. And yet all the numbers are going in the wrong direction at a population level. So you got 30% increase in suicides since 2000. You've got more people homeless, more people unemployed, more people incarcerated. It's like almost on any measure of public health, we suck. And yet on all of the measures of science and of opportunity and innovation, it's spectacular. How do you make sense of those two things? And that was really what I wrote the book to try to understand, because I couldn't figure it out. And I talked to a lot of people, read a lot of papers, went to visit a lot of places. And where I ended up is to say, well, it's not one thing. It's a bunch of things. There's a sense in which a lot of the things that work to help people recover are things we don't really do. We've got a broken healthcare system, right? And that a lot of what we offer doesn't help the people who need it, partly because they're not engaged. They don't like what we're offering. And so I say this as somebody in the healthcare system. What we sell, nobody's buying it, at least people with serious mental illness. And so for many, many, many of them, the problem is not access, it's engagement. They just aren't really, they're not going to meet us where we are, and we're not meeting them where they are. So that's a whole problem around what I call the quantity and quality problems of mental health care. But fundamentally, going back to your question, I think an issue is bigger than healthcare. It's really an issue about what we've become, what we value, how we support people in a society that doesn't do a good job of taking care of those with the greatest needs. We used to do better, I think, than we do now. And a lot of the kind of safety net, the attention to housing, the attention to putting people into care, the way we used to have community mental health centers, all of that stuff, which I grew up with, that's gone. It's mostly gone. And so we end up seeing a lot of homelessness, incarceration. People with serious mental illness die 15 to 20 years earlier than they should because they don't get decent health care. It's just this egregious lack of care and lack of support that leads to what I think we ultimately see as that mismatch between we have good stuff to offer, but it's not showing up at the population level.
Right. That all makes a lot of sense. And I definitely want to get into like the path forward and the solution probably towards the end of our conversation. I just thought it would be a good start to kind of unpack a little bit on your opinion on why we are where we are. And then I think now is a good place because Sarah has been one of these people that's been essentially just stuck in the system, right? For years and years and years, told she had one diagnosis after the next, after the next, after the next. So I know this term is going to be thrown out a lot in our conversation. So Tom, I guess one more question for you before I ask something for Sarah is if you could define what the DSM is, like why it was created, and then maybe like how has your view of the DSM evolved over the years?
DSM is Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. That's a weird name. Sarah probably has good thoughts about where the name came from, but it started, really the DSM-1, which I think was in 1953, was developed after the Second World War. Prior to World War II, really anybody who had severe mental illness or serious mental illness would be in a state asylum. And it kind of didn't matter what the diagnosis was because the treatments were all the same. And then what happened during the war was there was a lot of traumatic injury, a lot of PTSD, and a lot of acute syndromes that people didn't know how to deal with. And much to their amazement, techniques like Amitol and hypnosis actually worked and got people back to the front lines. And so coming out of the war, there was this sense that, hey, we actually can begin to treat people in an outpatient setting. And in an outpatient setting, we need to know what it is we're treating because there actually are different kinds of treatments, whether it's psychological or medical. And that led to the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, in the early 50s, bringing a group together, almost all of whom had served in the war as psychiatrists, to come up with a way of starting to classify mental illness. And they basically classified them into what were called adjustment disorders or neuroses versus organic disorders, which were more like tertiary syphilis or having a actual brain lesion. That evolved over the years, but no one paid all that much attention until about 1980 when DSM-3 came out. And I can actually say I was part of the task force that worked on that. And the reason that was necessary is because we had an absolute Tower of Babel. We were using terms like manic depressive illness and schizophrenia in completely different ways. So what people in the UK called manic depressive disorder, people in the United States called schizophrenia, and there was no way of understanding the literature because there was no consistency. And what DSM did, starting in 1980, was to provide a set of sort of guidelines for what to call symptoms as people saw them. And that really happened based on a clinical consensus. A bunch of people got together and said, these things tend to cluster together. If you have 3 out of the 5 or 5 out of the 9, you have X. And they voted on that, and that created this manual, which really, even then in 1980, it said, we're not going to make any assumption about cause, and we're not even going to make any presumption about treatment. These are just clusters of symptoms that fall together and give us a common dictionary. Fast forward 30 years and you can see where we're at. I'll let Sarah take it from there because it's what was a very useful dictionary in 1980 became a very dysfunctional encyclopedia by 2012.
Yeah. No, that's a great explanation of it. And thank you so much for providing that. So Sarah, let's get into your story a little bit. So what was going on like at the time where you first started going to a psychiatrist, going to therapy, where you're trying to understand what was happening in your life from a mental health perspective? And then if you could walk the listeners, as much as you're willing to share, through that journey and all the misdiagnoses and how you were feeling after each one, I think people would really appreciate that.
I could listen to Tom all day, by the way, so we can just keep going back to him. It's just great to be here and with him. I'm his biggest fan, I gotta say. So I didn't actually seek out the mental health system. I think like a lot of people, and especially now with the mental health crisis among teens and children, we're gonna see this even more, which is that I was 12 years old and my parents were divorcing and I was going to a new high school and I was extraordinarily sad and terrified. And I had a stomach ache and I not only didn't want to eat, I couldn't eat. I was not restricting calories or counting calories. I was not weighing myself obsessively, and I didn't think I was fat. Those are the three key sort of characteristics of anorexia. But my weight got extraordinarily low, and it got to the point one day where I couldn't hold down food and I couldn't hold down water. And my mother and father rushed me to the hospital, rightly so. And we ended up seeing my pediatrician. He happened to work at Children's Memorial Hospital, and he weighed me and he looked at me and he said, she has anorexia. And it was a word I'd never heard before. And I just remember my mother just looking so panicked and so, shaky about it. And my father just looking so confused. And we went home to my father's house. They were divorcing. And my father, I just remember him making me tomato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich and me not understanding, oh, I have this terrible disease. Like, wow, I just thought I was, I didn't know what was happening. I was too young. I knew I was really in pain, like emotional, weird. It wasn't physical, but it was physical, and I didn't know. So suddenly I had this term for it. And I wasn't an anorexic at that time, but I became one. And we didn't have the pro-ana, thinspo sites that they have now, which, endorse anorectic behavior and eating disorders. But I found a novel called The Best Little Girl in the World, written by Stephen Levenkron, who happened to be Karen Carpenter's last doctor before she died. And I learned how to be an anorexic from that book. It's about a girl who has anorexia. And I started to count calories, and I started to weigh myself, and I started to believe I was fat. I mean, I went through body dysmorphia. I mean, I just watched, my mother watched it happen. And they were told I would never get well. I was told I would never get well. They were told I was going to die. And so that's how I kind of came into my teenage years and understanding myself as a human being. I mean, that's such a formative time. And I just am so concerned with these young people who are getting diagnoses. And anxiety and depression diagnoses have gone up 30% among children and teenagers. So 3 to 18, ages 3 to 18. And that's just in the last year. So anyway, so that's a big concern. I did get well in the sense of I was out of crisis and out of outpatient programs and all of that. I went to college. But in my 20s, I moved to New York, and I was a writer in residence in the New York City public schools, and I was teaching in very low income areas. And it was a tough job in the sense of I had no money. I was living in terrible places. I was, teaching under extraordinary conditions. And New York is a fantastic city, or it sucks the life out of you. It sucked the life out of me. And I became so edgy. I just felt like I was splintering. And that's what I said. And I went to my GP for an annual visit. I'd never seen him before. It was 15 minutes long, was our visit. I didn't say anything except that I was having trouble sleeping and I felt nervous and like edgy. And he gave me a prescription for Valium and generalized anxiety disorder after 15 minutes. So the other thing that other people are really experiencing now, which we don't talk about, is that 5 of my 6 diagnoses came from my GP, from my family doctor or pediatrician and, general practitioner after a 15-minute visit. So then I remained in New York, and my cat died. And that will sound ridiculous to people who aren't pet people, but I was mourning her greatly. I'd had her for 16 years, and she was the closest person to me. I was totally alone in New York. And so I really mourned heavily for a year and was trying to run so much to manage my sorrow and my grief that I actually was just abusing my body. And it's in the book. I had this terrible blister and this whole thing. And a friend of mine said, you really have to see my therapist. I went to see her. We had that 45-minute session. And after the first session, she didn't ask me about the 6-year relationship that I'd been in years before that had just ended. She didn't ask me about, anything that was going on with my, I didn't mention my cat. It didn't come up. And she said, you have major depressive disorder. See this psychiatrist. He'll really help you. And I chose not to. So again, this is a little bit different from other people in that I wasn't just thrust into the system. I really tried everything to stay out of it and tried everything not to take medication. I then was taking Chinese herbs,
I just want to clarify something really quick. So
yeah.
You talked about how you got really into running and you were working out and you got a blister. Were you also at this time before seeing this therapist, were you feeling really down in your life? Were you feeling like depressed? Is that like, because I mean, I'm just trying to understand, like if you walk into the office, like what were you telling this therapist who diagnosed you with major depressive disorder?
Yeah, so I was there because I wasn't functioning and I was crying all the time. So that was there and that did come up. So we definitely talked about my symptoms, and that's pretty classic, right? So what happened in all of the cases was that the focus was on my symptoms and not on my life. And that's, I think, one reason why, or I'd like to think that's one reason why I got the, diagnoses that I did. I think we're also as a culture just very oriented toward diagnoses and have been since 1980. And, when we talk about education, there's this focus on diagnoses without really knowing what they are. I didn't know what they were. I thought she was diagnosing me with something very, very real and solid and like being told you have diabetes. But then in my 30s, I still wasn't getting well in the sense of I was still having those feelings of splintering, kind of basically having what we used to call nervous breakdowns. My mother ended up picking me up from New York and then taking me to her house. And I essentially convalesced for a year living with her. I was very lucky. Then I went and got my PhD and I was diagnosed with ADHD and OCD. And then finally I ended up, this is sort of skipping over the book, but I ended up suicidal and in crisis and ended up being told in a hospitalization program that I had bipolar disorder. And so then that led to, really that's when, once I was told that I had ADHD, I was put on Ritalin, and then I was told I had anxious and depressive elements, and that brought on an SSRI. But once I was told I had bipolar and started in and out of outpatient hospitalization programs and partial hospitalization programs for suicidality, that's when the drugs really started. And I was on almost everything, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, everything. That's the story. And that's where I ended up until I finally saw a psychiatrist. I was in crisis. I had been unable to live independently for 5 years. I had been living with my mother. I could only work part-time. I believed I was bipolar. I believed it was me. I lived my entire life according to that identity. I believed I would never have a long-term relationship because I was told that I would die early, that I would likely die by suicidality, and my, the cycles would never end and they get closer together unless I was on lithium or unless I was on this antipsychotic or I was on that. And I was in crisis. I didn't have a psychiatrist, and I went to a new psychiatrist, and we had the 30-minute session, and I waited for him to proclaim what my diagnosis was. And he looked at me and he said, "I don't know what you have." And it just changed my world. And I thought, no one knows what I have. And that's when I started investigating diagnoses, and I started to realize how much I had over-identified with each diagnosis that I'd gotten.
Wow. Thank you so much for being vulnerable and sharing all that. I guess where I want to go next with this is, so you're in this psychiatrist's office and he essentially tells you I don't know what's wrong with you. I haven't figured it out. What's been the path forward? What's been the recovery process? Have you been able to go back now and unpack where a lot of this stemmed from, what the root was at all of this, and how have you now learned to deal with a lot of the stuff that you've gone through in a way that's healthy?
Well, it's been amazing. I'm writing the sequel to Pathological right now about how I healed and trying to give people really concrete steps as to how I did it. And one thing that I have to say is that, I'm so fortunate in that I had a place. Tom, I'm sure we'll talk about the 3 Ps, but I had a place, I had people, and I had a purpose in my life. So I'm so lucky that I have my family. They never gave up on me. I distanced myself from them. They're the heroes of my book and of my life. And most people with mental illness, a lot of people will be able to relate to that. The families get no credit, really. But I also had a place to heal. And I think when I was at my worst, I really was starting to heal. So when I was at my mother's, because I had that place to convalesce, I was starting that healing process, even though I looked very, very sick at that time. And I also had a purpose, which was always teaching and writing. So that never went away for me. But what happened for me was once he said, I don't know, he's still my psychiatrist. He's in the book. I respect him greatly. He's very transparent with me about the flaws in the DSM. We talk about it a lot. And he did give me a diagnosis. He has since changed it twice. I don't know what my diagnosis is. I've asked him not to tell me. And the reason was that I just knew I would identify with it. I knew that what I was doing was making every bout of sadness and depression, every panic attack, which I had one 2 days ago, was about my diagnosis. When I was hyper or high energy, it was because I'm bipolar. I couldn't just be anything. I couldn't just experience emotions anymore. And my thoughts, racing thoughts, meant something was wrong, instead of the fact that I have racing thoughts a lot. And the odd thing was that once I stopped identifying with my diagnosis, my symptoms lessened to an incredible degree. And once I started living and saying, the doctors are wrong, I can be cured. Like, this is going to happen, and I'm going to make this happen. And once I got on that path, then it's like living in a different brain. I mean, I'm just a totally different person. Now, there's been a lot of small things along the way, and that's what I'm putting in the book. Like, to give you an example, I do this thing every morning. I wake up and I have a pad of paper like this, and I write down all my thoughts in a list, just down the page, 5 minutes, not even 2 minutes. They are so negative. They are so unbelievably negative. And one thing that's been very helpful to me is evolutionary psychiatry. And I've learned my brain is designed to keep me alive, and it is designed to look for danger and what's wrong. And most of what I think is incorrect. Most of it is an overreaction to the environment. And so I write them down and I look at them and I think, okay, this is just my brain doing its thing. I crumple up the piece of paper, I throw it away, and I go on with my day. It's such a small thing, but it makes such a difference because I feel like my brain needs to be heard, like the worry and everything. And it's like, okay, we got it out and now we go forward. But there are a lot of things like that I do now just to keep myself, I don't even want to say steady because it's just completely different.
So this question's for both of you. And you've talked about like the DSM and the role that it's played in diagnosing, misdiagnosing you, Sarah, and also Tom, in the evolution of where we are right now in the mental health landscape. But do you think things would have been different for you, Sarah, if, say, like, 'cause that's pretty typical, right? You go into a psychiatrist's office, often in crisis, often it's not very common that you go in to start therapy when things are going well in your life, right? And they want to give you a diagnosis based on where you're at in that moment. Do you think it would have been different for you if they said, okay, great, I'm going to follow you around for 6 months. I'm going to observe your behavior. I'm going to watch what you're doing every single day. Do you think that they would have been able to give you a more accurate diagnosis based on the DSM, or do you think that the DSM is in itself just flawed?
I mean, again, I'm not a doctor and I'm not like Tom, I wasn't in the midst of it, but what I learned from my research was really shocking. And the fact that, DSM diagnoses, with the exception of dementia and rare chromosomal disorders, are scientifically invalid was like, you got to be kidding me, that I didn't even think about it. You're right. I'd never gotten a blood test. No one had proven to me that I didn't have or did have these disorders. And then that they weren't reliable. I just didn't know that. So for me, I think what would have made a huge difference is if they had said to me, you are going through something right now. And you need treatment, because I did. I mean, there's no question that something was wrong. There's no question that I had a serious mental illness. I mean, you don't end up suicidal, it's just clear. And certain other things that went on in my life. But if they had said, you're going through something right now and we're going to get you treatment, and then there's something after that. Like I was never given a future ever. I mean, there was never a talk of me weaning off a drug or perhaps getting better or perhaps feeling better. All of my diagnoses, I was told, were chronic, and there's no evidence of that. And there is some evidence that some are, and okay, but I still think the fact that I wasn't given hope was the worst part of it, or I wasn't given an alternative to, okay, you've got this, you're someone with ADHD, or you have an ADHD brain, is something I hear my students say now, and there's no such thing. There's just no such thing. And how much I limited myself and how much I see, because I'm a professor, I see this, we are on the front lines. I mean, the number of students I have, not only with a diagnosis, but 3 or 4 diagnoses is astonishing. And they're so identified with them that I'm concerned, because they see the diagnosis as the reason, for instance, they're struggling with a class. And they can't just struggle with a class. It's like, that means forever. You're always going to be that. And again, I'm not there to counsel them, so I don't, but that's not what I'm qualified to do, but I'm aware of it. So I think if young people are told, You went through a pandemic. You spent 2 years in your bedroom. Being depressed or severely anxious is a completely logical response to that. Instead, they're being told you have major depressive disorder, with suicidality or whatever it is, or you have generalized anxiety disorder or social anxiety disorder. Instead of you're going through something, you're amazingly strong. Look at what you've lived through. No one's ever lived through that. Like, what kind of path are we putting them on? That's my concern right now.
Yeah, I agree with you, and you're right. I think, just being told that this is like your destiny forever and that you're going to be somebody with depression or you're going to be somebody with anxiety for the rest of your life, I'm sure it can be very daunting, because I think at the end of the day, like, all we want is hope and some sort of control over our situation. And once we learn that we have both of those, I think we can start to implement and take action to get better. And I think like that's the path forward, right? Is developing some sort of self-awareness, taking action, and then adjusting along the way. So Tom, like, I want to get your insights on this. Is what Sarah just shared, is that pretty common? Like, do you hear a lot of stories like this where people are just on this journey to find out what's wrong with them because they've been given diagnosis after diagnosis after diagnosis?
Well, there's a lot to unpack in what Sarah said. And Sarah, you're so good at describing this, and your journey, I think, is just incredibly helpful for a lot of people to hear about. So I'm really grateful that you've written about it and you're talking about it. I was just thinking while you were talking that when I think I even mentioned this in my book, very early in my career, like at the very beginning, I was seeing somebody, as a physician, you do rounds where you go around with a senior master clinician and they ask you questions. Often it's very intimidating. And I was explaining that this person that I had just interviewed had schizophrenia, met all the criteria for schizophrenia. And the master clinician, whose name was Herb Pardes, he's become a giant in the field. He was the head of Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center for many, many years. He's kind of an icon. But he turned to me and he said, okay, so you've told me about 5% of what I want to know. And his point was that the diagnosis, at least in psychiatry, isn't meant to be comprehensive. It's just a way of describing a set of symptoms that give us a common language. But it certainly is not a way to define identity. And I think when you listen to Sarah, what I like about what you said, Sarah, and you said it in so many ways, is that we have to distinguish illness from identity. That's hard to do when you're 16. Right? So remember, when we're talking about mental illness, and mental illness is a real thing, but it generally starts before age 24. Sometimes, like with Sarah, starts in middle school or high school, just when you're developing an identity. So it's not so surprising that people conflate the two, including the people who have the illness themselves. They begin to think, this is who I am and this is who I'll always be. What I love about your story was your recognition that, yeah, I was going through this. This is where I lived for a while, but it's not who I am. And that's a distinction we don't talk about enough. It's incredibly important at many levels. At the level that you went through, where you had to begin to understand that you weren't going to have to live with this forever, that this was not your fate, this was a state, and that you would, in fact, recover and improve and be able to talk about it and write about it and help other people get through it. But there's another side to it, which I think is even maybe more insidious. And that is when we confuse illness and identity as caregivers, we lose hope, right? We see somebody who's homeless and hallucinating and eating out of a dumpster, and we think that's who that person is, instead of recognizing that that's schizophrenia talking. That's what that illness looks like. But that's not who that person is. And if you treat that illness, there's a very different person underneath. We have, as a society, completely forgotten that and ignored that. And we've begun to think that, those people who are homeless living under a bridge have chosen to do that because that's where they belong. And that's who they are. And it's an extraordinary indictment of who we've become, that we've allowed that to happen. And that I live in the Bay Area, I live near Oakland, California, and virtually every bridge has got an encampment underneath it. If you had told me as a young psychiatrist that people that I was treating with brain disorders like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder were going to end up homeless or incarcerated, I would have said, there's no way. We don't do that. That's not who we are. That's not care. That's not compassionate. And yet that is for way, way, way too many people who with these illnesses. That's their fate. And why is that? Partly it's because we have gotten that confused. We've been thinking that it's not just that they have schizophrenia, but they are schizophrenic. And we don't understand, just as you said, Sarah, that it's something they were going through. It's treatable. It's fixable in the sense that they don't have to be living under a bridge forever. But we're not doing the compassionate thing here. We're letting the illness drive the narrative and not the person.
Right. So do you think that, Tom, do you think that the DSM in a way has had some positives and that, like you said, it's given this collaborative idea around symptoms of a certain illness, but that's kind of where the line gets drawn, and that everything else has kind of been toxic in the way that now you're labeling somebody with a disorder and that becomes their identity. So do you think that there has been some positives with the DSM?
Well, I think the intent was good. The intent is to come up with a common language and to help people to get care, to get treated. The way it's used is where the problem comes out. I think people tend to read it as if it's the gospel. It's a working document that keeps getting revised. I've got problems with it, but my problems are a little bit different than Sarah's. Actually, Sarah captured this. In the real world of what people experience, they rarely fit into any of those buckets. And it's more common for people to have 2 or 3 of those labels than just one. And these are just labels, right? So you have to take them as just that. That's a piece of it. Sarah said something else, though, that I think is really important and almost always overlooked, and that is that it's just a collection of symptoms. And if what you're trying to do is just reduce symptoms, then you're missing the opportunity to actually understand something that may be more causative, what's behind the symptoms. It's like if all we could do for someone having a heart attack was to treat their chest pain. Actually, it's important to treat the chest pain. That's good. You want to give something for the pain, but that's not getting at the underlying issues, which might require a stent or might require something else. My concern is that if you build a discipline around symptoms, then you look for treatments and therapies that just go after symptoms and they don't go any further. And so what I've been pushing for many, many years now is that, at least for the people in the research community, and that's what I was really working with at NIMH, was the research community, that we just put this aside for a while. And yeah, of course you collect symptoms, but you also collect sleep data and EEG data, and you look at hormones, and you look at lots of other things, maybe even wearable data, social connection data, lots of other stuff. And then you put it all together and you try to figure out, all right, maybe with machine learning or with new data science, how does all this really hang together and how does it relate to treatment? Because again, DSM is agnostic in terms of treatment. That's kind of sad. You want, in any other part of medicine, you use diagnosis to decide treatment. So here, why not actually figure out who's responding to psychotherapy or medication, work backwards, and then understand how this fits together. The effort to do that is called RDoC, the Research Domain Criteria Project. Started about 10 years ago at the NIMH. Still very much a work in progress. It's not ready for prime time. It's not ready for clinical use. But it at least has redirected the research community to say, let's be humble. Let's step back and say we don't really know how to cut nature at the joints. Let's just figure this out based on what we can observe and also what the biology tells us, what the social determinants tell us. Let's put all that together and figure out whether there's a better way.
You brought up so many good points, and I do want to kind of stay on this subject a little bit because there are people that are listening to this that are going through stuff. They're depressed, they're feeling anxious, and you talked about the pandemic that we've gone through the past couple of years, and I don't think it's as simple in many cases to tell somebody like, don't worry, you're just going through something. Because I think while they are, I think it's not going to help them manage their anxiety or depressive symptoms. But at the same time, I think it's smart to make sure they find the right person and they're in the right frame of mind to talk to that person about what's going on. So maybe both of you can chime in, but Tom, let's start with you. Like, what do you recommend to somebody then who is listening to this, or maybe they're a parent and they have a kid who's just feeling anxious or feeling depressed? Like, what steps can they take to begin to get well?
Well, connecting is really important, and it's probably the essence of what we do in therapy, is having someone we trust and someone who can give us hope and who may have been through some of this themselves. It doesn't have to be a therapist. It never has had to be a therapist. We've had these issues for millennia, and we learn to we learn to get through them by connecting with each other, supporting each other, and sharing the journey. Now, there's no magic to that. There's nothing esoteric or particularly difficult about it. I'm not sure why it's become an industry for us, but it has. But it doesn't have to be somebody who's necessarily credentialed. It can be somebody that you trust who often may have gone through something very similar.
Yeah. And I guess to follow up on that, like, what if there is somebody that is really like having a hard time and like that just isn't cutting it and they need to go seek like medical attention? Like, how do you make sure you're able to sift through and find somebody that is not only reputable, but can evaluate what you're going through from a macro perspective versus just the micro, what's going on in that moment?
Maybe I'll say just a little bit, and then Sarah, I'd love you to jump in as well. I mean, one of the parts of Sarah's narrative that I thought was so interesting, and it's so typical, is that most people end up going to their primary care provider, a pediatrician or a family doc. And those are great people, but they usually don't have the time and may not have the experience to do more than write a prescription. And writing a prescription that's not care. I mean, that may help with some of the symptoms, but it's not usually the answer to the issue. So I think it's more helpful to find someone who is trained. And there are very good psychological treatments that have been developed scientifically, validated scientifically, and show almost the same efficacy as medications, especially for people with more mild to moderate symptoms like depression and anxiety. If people are really incapacitated and really crippled, those kinds of psychological therapies may be hard to use, and their medication can be helpful, the combination best of all. And for that, you have to go to a specialist. Now, where do you find those people? I often recommend people look at NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness. They have chapters all across the country, and they have connections to who's reputable, who's doing good work in the community. You can also go online and try to get some ideas. And today, partly because of the pandemic, almost everybody has a remote practice instead of having a brick and mortar practice, which means that there's the possibility of going to these large digital providers, some of which are actually pretty good because they give you a huge amount of choice. So you can actually look for, if you're an African-American gay man, you can find somebody who works with people just like you, which is important in this space, is to have somebody who can relate to the world that you come from. That may be hard to do locally, but can be easier to do now that we have these massive groups online that you can access, and there are several companies that do that. I'm involved with many of them, so I'm not going to promote any of them here. But I do think that they do a spectacular service for improving access to therapy and sometimes to medications as well.
Thanks, Tom, for providing that valuable insight from a medical perspective. Sarah, I want to go to you now. So knowing what you know now and going through your journey, if somebody or a parent of somebody who's going through like something similar to what you were going through, like really having a hard time figuring out what was going on, like what would you tell them before they got started and before they set foot in a medical setting?
Well, first of all, just that it is so hard on the families. And now that I speak to my father and my mother and my sister and brother-in-law just about what they were going through and not knowing what to do. And I just want to say that I sympathize so much, and I've heard from my own family, and I know how hard it was for them to be watching me go through this and not know how to help. And to everyone who is going through it, we're actually going through the same thing. I mean, when you're in crisis, you want to help yourself and you can't. I mean, that's what's weird, so But the first thing I always say to people is if you are in crisis, to call 911. Soon we'll have the 988 number, and that's an emergency number. And there were times when I was in an emergency situation and I needed immediate, if not care, because my experience at the emergency room was not the best, but it did get me to a safe place. And that needs to happen. So it won't be the best, but that's where you need to go. And so you just go there. But that's the first thing. But what I see happening is that I thought there was one step to mental health or restoring mental health, and there are actually two. So the first step is to get treatment and commit to that treatment, whatever it is. So for one person, it's going to be medication, and for another, it's going to be meditation. And that's fine. But we have to commit to it and really look to it. And then what we tend to do, or what I tended to do, was I looked for the solution or the key or relief or healing in the diagnosis, learning about the diagnosis, talking about the diagnosis. Now we self-diagnose on social media. We go to TikTok therapists, right? And what I found is actually stepping away from the diagnosis, the healing is in the treatment. It's whatever you've committed to doing. So whether it's medication or meditation and whatever you can add to supplement that, that's really where the focus needs to be. And oddly, I think that our focus tends to be on diagnoses and how negative they are. And we use them against ourselves instead of using them to empower ourselves. Just to give you like a kind of example where that doesn't happen, the one case I've been able to find is autism. That community, I mean, they are so bolstered by their diagnosis. They get resources from their diagnosis. They champion each other. Like, it is a real source of pride. I don't see that in any other, in the, major depressive disorder community or the bipolar community, because they only have negative connotations, or very rarely there might be sort of a kind of grotesque, the romanticization of depression or something like that, but nothing positive really. So that's why I mean, just step away from the diagnosis. The other thing that I did not know, and this will sound ridiculous coming from someone who is in the mental health care system for 30 years, get a second opinion always. Always get a second opinion. I had no idea.
Yeah, great idea. Great idea, Sarah. Yeah, I think that's really smart.
Yeah. And I know that's a luxury. I do. And so I'm also scared to ask for second opinions. And most people, we are scared of our mental health professionals. And for me, it was my GP. But the other thing I learned is you can ask your GP, if they give you a diagnosis, to confirm it with a psychiatrist. And they should do that for you. And I didn't know that either. So that's like kind of a way to get, not all of us have access to a psychiatrist. And from what I hear right now, getting in to see a child psychiatrist, there's 6 months to a year wait. So if you need to do that, you can ask your GP to consult. So those are a few things that can help.
Yeah. Can I build on something? Because I think, again, Sarah, there's a lot in what you've said. One of the things that I think is really helpful is this idea that there's sort of two phases. If you leave this interview and you get hit by a truck and you have a broken leg, you're going to go to an emergency room. The leg will be set. You'll have a cast on. You'll get some medication to deal with the pain. Cast will come off in a couple of weeks, and then you're going to have 6 months, 9 months of rehabilitative care, right? Physical therapy, getting your strength back. We know that. That's how you recover. If you have a psychotic break, people don't think of it like that. They think about, okay, you get that acute care, and then you're on your own, baby. It's up to you. So it's important to remember that what we need to do going forward, and this is irrespective of what the label is that the treatment needs to be about not just that acute response, but what we now call recovery care, the ability to recover and to keep that as the goal. It's not just treating that acute pain, which is important to do, but it's to have your eyes on the prize, which is coming back, because when you break a leg, by the way, the part that heals is the strongest part of the bone. And so here too, hearing that narrative, knowing that, yeah, there is hope. You can recover. You can get back to work. You can get back to school. You can have a relationship, and you can thrive. But you need three things. And that's going back to what you said before, Sarah, the 3 Ps that I write about so much in the book: people, place, and purpose. Now, those things are critical for recovery, but they're not part of our healthcare system. And so one of the reasons I did the book was to sort of point this out, that we're spending almost $4 trillion on our healthcare system, hospitals, clinics, pharmaceuticals. But when it comes to recovery, clubhouses, social connection, the things that we know really make a difference, the people, place, and purpose, we have to hold a bake sale. We don't pay for that. And all of that's going through nonprofits who hope for donors and may get them and may not. But that's the stuff that actually works. That's the stuff that helps people to get back in the game. And we've got to start thinking about that as being part of healthcare. We've got to use some of that $4 trillion to actually pay for things that are not very expensive, but are very, very effective. I think you found that kind of in your own journey, that having a family that was supportive, giving yourself the time to recover, and getting a purpose, getting something to recover for, that was really critical. But none of that got paid for. And so that's where I think we have to change our incentives. We have to begin to think about, what do we care about here? Do we care just about acute symptoms, getting people out of the office as quickly as possible or out of the hospital, reducing costs no matter what? Or do we care about actually helping people to recover and thrive?
There's also, I love your broken bone metaphor, Tom, and I actually have stolen it for my new book, just so you know. I will give you full credit, I promise. But one thing I extend it to is, so for me, I pretty much over 30 years probably broke every bone in my body. That's how it felt after everything I'd been through. So I am someone who broke every bone in her body. I am extremely strong, but bones heal differently, and different parts of me, some bones don't heal right. And sometimes, there's, pain, chronic pain in certain places. And I have to live and honor what I've been through. And this is for patients who want to go back to some life or want to live a ordinary or normal or whatever we think other people can do. And I want to be very clear. I am where I am because of certain things. I don't drink. I don't smoke. I don't do drugs. I don't drink caffeine. I mean, I could go on and on and on. I mean, it's an almost ridiculous list, but what I went through was severe. And so I think we forget that too, which is there's also this place that I think of people who've been through cancer, and that's the kind of also a metaphor I'm looking at in my book is, you don't think, oh, I can just eat anything. Or, I mean, maybe some people do, but I sort of idealize it as there's more to the sort of healing and the next step too, which is that I don't think we should be aiming to get to some place we used to be or some ideal, but yeah.
Yeah, but even beyond that, I mean, one of the ways to think about this is there's a revolution going on in mental health care, which is moving away from credentialed experts, and we'll never have enough of them, to empowering people who have been through an experience like you've been through and helping them to help others. And by the way, there's nothing more therapeutic. I can say this as a provider once, that there's nothing more therapeutic than helping somebody else, right? Giving help is far more empowering than getting help. But we don't allow people who've been through it often to do that. Today, the peer movement is changing all that. So one of the ways that many, many places in the country are dealing with the workforce shortage and that long wait for a child psychiatrist or long wait for a therapist or anybody else for that matter, is to say, hey, there are people who've become involuntary experts here. They've lived it, and they've learned something about how to recover, about what it takes. Sarah, you're like the hero here. Like, you have done this perfectly in spades. You've really paid your dues. And now, and you've done it with the book, but for lots of other people, they can do it by helping others, like lending a hand and like passing that forward in a way that really can save lives. So we're actually now at a point where I think that will become a huge part of what mental health care looks like over the next decade, is that there still will be the professionals, there'll be the doctors, the nurses, the psychologists, and the social workers and other therapists. But there'll be this group of people who have become expert because of their experience, and they'll use that to be as helpful as they can be to others.
Absolutely. And you're both, again, like so spot on with the way we have to change the recovery process from a mental health care perspective. And one of the things that's helped me, it's helped so many people that have been on the podcast, listen to the podcast, is fitness. is moving their bodies, is changing the way they eat, it's changing their health habits. So Tom, from a medical and scientific perspective, like what are your thoughts on this? Because you hear so many people say like the best natural antidepressant is exercise, and like one of the best ways to reduce anxiety is to go for a walk or work out or do all these things. Like, what is your view on that? And do you think that it should be a fundamental principle of recovery from mental health issues?
Yeah, especially I would say for the mild to moderate end, sort of like the shallow end of the pool, which is where most people are. The data are getting better and better about the impact of exercise. The effect sizes aren't huge, but there have been a set of studies over the last, I'd say, 3 to 4 years that, in aggregate make a pretty strong case for the value of exercise as an antidepressant, as an anti-anxiety approach. For people who are more severe, people who will have really disabling depression, it may be more difficult for them to even, there's something called psychomotor retardation. And you can see this with people who are severely depressed. Their voice slows down, their voice actually loses power. So they have a very weak voice, and they may move very little. They may sleep all the time. And I think this is very hard to get them moving. But even then, getting them moving can be an important part of the beginning of recovery. They're going to need more than exercise. They're going to need probably medication, maybe therapy. They're going to need the whole bundle of interventions to be able to recover. But they will recover.
Right. And I guess the reason I bring this up isn't just because of what I've learned with myself and through others. It's like you see the chart of the increased amount of people who are having mental health struggles, and then like obesity epidemic, like this health epidemic that we're in, where so many people are unhealthy. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on if there really is this direct correlation between your mental health and physical health.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, it's pretty clear that, as I often say, mental illnesses are brain disorders in the sense that the brain is part of the body. And we don't fully understand exactly all the ways in which that is true, but there's no question that there is a correlation between mental health and physical health, and that improving your physical health is a big part of creating a more complete mental health picture. It's not the whole thing, but it's definitely a big part of it.
I think that's another reason why I know how severe my own mental illness was. I was actually doing everything a lot right then. I had quit drinking. I didn't do drugs. I was a runner. I did yoga, to the point that I was just trying so hard. I remember feeling just like I was gripping something, trying so hard to keep it together. And I tried through running, and then I would go teach, and then I would go do yoga, and I would walk over the bridges in New York City. It sounds a bit manic, which is probably why I got a bipolar disorder diagnosis. And it was just trying so hard to do that. But I did CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. I did DBT. I did ACT. I meditated. I went and spent time at Plum Village with Thich Nhat Hanh. I did it all. And I laid on the floor in my living room and felt my inner body with Eckhart Tolle. I did it all. And it wasn't enough. It just wasn't. There are people who it's so severe that I did need medication. I did need, crisis treatment, and that's okay. There was nothing wrong with that. I think sometimes we think that's a failure, but it wasn't. It was just, we all need different things at different times.
And of course, yeah, I'm sorry, Sarah.
Yeah. Oh, just that I don't want any, I know that I felt bad that I couldn't help myself. Like, why, what was I could do this, and this was going to do it, and this was going to do it. And so, no, not, we need all of it. So.
Yeah, I would agree. The other thing to remember is that there are times when exercise is part of the problem, right? And when it becomes compulsive and it's no longer voluntary, but it's something you have to do. So it can get a little more complicated. Anorexia is a great example of that, where kids will really drive themselves to exhaustion, and for very pathological reasons. So it's important to understand what's behind the activity as well.
I was self-medicating with exercise, too. That's for sure, because I did get the runner's high, and I would feel better. But
isn't that kind of a good thing though, to get a runner's high? Like if you're feeling off, or having like a bad day to go out, get your endorphins going, go for a run and kind of clear your mind. I mean, isn't that a positive thing?
Absolutely. It just wasn't enough for me. I was still as splintering and breaking down. It just didn't do it. That's all I mean. I think it was a great thing to do. I think I would have been in much, much worse shape and been hospitalized much sooner than I was. There's no question. If I hadn't been exercising the way I was. It was in pathological in the sense that I was medicating with it. And I think that was a good thing to some degree. I was also really hurting my body. It was too much, but ultimately it was never going to be enough.
So I guess, like, Sarah, my question for you is, so I'm just imagining a listener listening to this, and I've had no people who have had symptoms like similar to you, and like have gone to doctor after doctor after doctor, and diagnosis after diagnosis and diagnosis, and just felt like a failure, like lost hope, being like, what is wrong with me? Like, why can't they figure out what's going on with me? Why does this keep happening? Like, how am I ever going to get well? Like, if you were going through that like years ago and knowing what you know now with the wisdom and the knowledge you've gained, like what kind of advice would you try to give to somebody like yourself in that situation to allow them to not give up on themselves?
I think it was very hard for me to stop looking for the answer in a diagnosis. And when I found out that mental health diagnoses are invalid and mostly unreliable and kind of all the drama that has gone along with them, it was like someone was pulling the earth out from under me. I identified so heavily with that, and I thought it was the answer. And it makes sense. With physical illness, you get a diagnosis. They sometimes know the cause, not always, but they certainly have some idea, given the diagnosis, what the best treatment might be, and then what your prognosis will be. And we don't have that with mental health disorders. And so I guess what I would say is it can't be your fault because it's not set up perfectly. So, but I also understand just feeling that it will never, ever get better. I had an interview on TV a couple of weeks ago on a local station in Chicago, WGN, and it was across the street from the first partial hospitalization program I was in. And the irony was like beyond rich. I just thought, if you had told me, I used to sit outside and have my lunch and stare at the TV station. And I was just breaking. Like if you told me that anything could have gotten better, I never would have believed you. And there I was, and it just felt like so perfect to be there and remember where I'd been, and just that it really can get better. And I think a lot of it is believing it can. I think that's a huge part of it.
Thank you again for sharing, Sarah, like so authentically, like your wisdom, your insights on not only your story, but for others. I guess my question is, you hear a lot about choice when it comes to mental health, and in that, that person's just depressed because they're making bad choices, or that person's just anxious because they're making bad choices, or I can go on and on with examples. And I do think that personal choice certainly matters, like in order to get better with your mental health. Like I do think you have to, in some cases, like change what you're doing. You got to address your sleep. You got to stop drinking caffeine at night. You got to maybe exercise if that's something you can have a healthy relationship, or, get out of that relationship, or whatever it is. But like, Tom, based on what you know with the science, like, are people like choosing to be like mentally ill, or is it, for the majority of people, is it just something they have no control over?
Yeah, I think it was 1853 when Abraham Lincoln was trying to counsel somebody who was severely depressed. In those days, they called it melancholia. And he wrote them a letter in which he said, and he knows this based on his own experience, he said, always remember that melancholia is a misfortune, not a fault. I think that is a good way for us to think about it. This is a misfortune. It's a problem, but it's not a fault. It's not a crime. We need to address it accordingly.
I agree with you. And I think that like we need to have empathy and compassion for people that are hurting, that are struggling, and knowing that they're not happy, like they're not well. And like, why would somebody choose that life? Sarah, what impact, like in your recovery process over the last few years, like what impact has the choices that you've made personally in your life has it had on the improvement in your mood, your well-being, and in your journey throughout this process?
because I believe that I'm healed and because I believed I could heal, it became like the choices took on a different flavor. They weren't punishments. They weren't medicine anymore. They were like, oh, this is the way to, I haven't given up on happiness. I'm not that into happiness anymore. I'm into joy. Like joy is my thing. Happiness is like a sugar high and joy is like a really good meal that makes you feel good. But moving toward that now, exercise, not drinking alcohol. I mean, if I'm taking an antidepressant, drinking a depressant, it's not going to go well. Like it just isn't. And so that, like things like that, it just makes sense to me. And the other thing is been trying to understand my mind and being more generous with it and like creating a relationship with it and my brain, you know, whatever you want to call it, or the interplay of the two. But what I mean is I mentioned, you know, evolutionary psychiatry, which has its flaws and downsides. But what has always made sense to me is one, just that my brain is always trying to keep me alive. And I'm a very like high-strung person. If we were on the savannah, on the plain, in a clan, I was the one you wanted in your clan because I'm looking for lions like everywhere, all the time. Opening email, like there's a lion everywhere. So, and now I know I am that person. I have like crippling anxiety sometimes, but I do also have a different relationship to it, which is that my brain is trying to keep me alive. Like it's just doing what it does. There's nothing wrong with my brain. I'm really good at being a primitive human. It just doesn't fit this society and the culture and my life now. And at the same time, what some theorize, and whether or not this is true almost doesn't matter to me because it just makes sense to me, is that depression, they've thought, is sometimes maybe the body's way of kind of calming you down after a long period of anxiety, that you've been up, and then depression comes to ease you down. And so I just sort of look at it like that. Now, sometimes I have, waves of sadness that seem to come from nowhere, and that's fine too. But having that different relationship with what's quote unquote wrong with me and not seeing it as a flaw has made a huge difference.
Yeah, because then your choices become like assets in your life, and you like know the path forward and where you want to go, and you're able to make those that are in alignment with that and saying, oh, I'm choosing to do this because I know that if I do, I'm going to continue to heal and get well and that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess the last question that I have before we kind of bring this to a close is for Tom. And we kind of touched on this at the beginning. We talked about like why we are where we are right now with the mental health crisis that we've been in, and that things that were once available aren't now, and things are missing. So I guess if you had the key to the car and you were driving that car to the destination that was helping us to get out of this mental health mess that we're in, like what would you do? Like what would you do differently so that we can get out of this?
Here's the surprising answer. Everything we need is hiding in plain sight. We know how to do this. There's no mystery here. Everything we need to get to a much, much better place. It's not one thing. A big piece of it is what we talked about before. It's moving to a model that's not just medical. We need to keep that, but includes that recovery phase. So both the acute treatment, but also all of the rehabilitative services that let people recover. Another big part of it, so there'll be three pieces. That's number one. Number two is really fixing the crisis services that we have now. Sarah mentioned that we'll be moving to 988 on July 16th nationwide. It's a new crisis number for mental health crisis. That's a good start, but it's just a start. What we really need is that when you're having a mental health crisis, the people who come are not police, are not fire, they're not a medical surgical ambulance. It's a nurse, it's a social worker, it's a peer. And if they arrive, it's in a van, it's not a cop car. And where they take you is not to a medical surgical emergency room or to jail, which is the most common thing now, but you go to a drop-off center where you can stabilize and get psychological support. So fixing crisis is number two. And number three is something we haven't talked about, but it's prevention. It's helping people before they get into a crisis. So beginning to think about what we do in the school system to help kids learn to cope, to give them skills that allow them to be more resilient. to help them identify what are the things that really are worrisome, and then the things that are just part of, dealing with a pandemic, dealing with just like bad stuff that happens to everybody. We need to do that. It's being done some places. I think Australia has really led the way with the future-proofing project in New South Wales. There are good examples of this. We aren't even beginning to think about that very much in the United States. And I think we need to start moving in that direction as well. So those are the three. It's recovery, better crisis care, prevention.
Amen to that. The prevention thing I think is so important. I think it's challenging because it's like, how do you communicate with kids? Like, I mean, do you have any insights, Tom, on like what a good way is for parents to talk to their kids about their mental health, or even if a teacher's listening to this or a guidance counselor and they want to maybe have these conversations? Like, how do you communicate with an 11-year-old about anxiety or depression?
Well, the amazing thing is that kids are doing it more and more without us. I just did an event with a bunch of high school students, and they were very open, talking about their anxiety and their concerns. And I said that to them. I said, wow, we used to think about stigma as being a real problem, that nobody wanted to talk about it. And they said, oh, no, we talk about this all the time. We just can't talk about it with our parents. So I think that the next generation is actually much more open.
I think you're right. I mean, I see it too in my students. The only downside to this is, again, it's just so focused on diagnoses. And so we're confusing anxiety, the emotion, with anxiety, the disorder, and depression, the emotion, with depression, the disorder. And so, again, like self-diagnosing on social media for young people, like that's, again, we just have to, I think we can facilitate there with, again, making that distinction, and that if you do receive a diagnosis, it's not necessarily a life sentence.
Sarah, that's great. You and I should do a New York Times op-ed on that. I love that. I think, I've heard this from others as well, and it's really critical to help kids understand that this is what you go through. I mean, just because you're having a bad week doesn't mean you have major depressive disorder, right? And the labels aren't helpful here.
I mean, they are helpful in that we get treatment, but what it did for me was I started to see life through a lens of diagnosis. I saw myself through a lens of diagnosis, and that's really hard to break out of. I mean, it took me 30 years.
I'm so glad you wrote that book and that you're doing these podcasts to sort of convey that. It's a great example of passing it forward. You have this piece of wisdom now. Boy, that was hard won, I know, but it's so great that you're sharing that and helping others.
Yeah, you're so right, Sarah, because I think like a diagnosis can at least give you some guidance as to maybe like the symptoms you have and how to address it, but you are not your diagnosis. Like you don't have to live with the identity of that for the rest of your life. And I'm glad that we've touched on that point for a good bit of this conversation, and also talking about the preventative stuff in schools. And I think that, I guess, the best case situation is to have like trained professionals come into these schools, or have people at home talking to their kids about feeling anxious and what's happening there and why you're feeling it. And then maybe like how to mitigate the symptoms and how to cope healthily and that sort of thing. But hopefully more and more that'll be going on as this new movement continues to unfold.
I mean, my question, though, is like, why would a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old or anyone even need to know the diagnosis or the symptoms, in the sense of like, if we're getting treatment and the person in charge is in charge, like, and they know what they're doing. So in the 19th century, no one, and even before the 1970s, really, no one knew their diagnosis, but you still got treatment. So I just think it's interesting, like, why do we think, identifying with a diagnosis is helpful? And sometimes it is for people. I know I've talked to many people who found great relief in it, but I've talked to many more people who then limit themselves and limit their lives because they think they are this thing. But especially at a young age, I just don't know where that can be, a positive. And it might be, but I just haven't seen it.
I was just, I guess, talking more in a broad perspective, like how like knowing what if you have something or getting treatment can be, at least you have the awareness of the symptoms, and then now you got to deal with the symptoms from the root cause and figure out like, why am I experiencing this? Because I mean, the fact of the matter is, I mean, you see it a lot, like teenagers they're suffering from anxiety. So like there's nothing to hide with that and a lot of it comes through comparison, a lot of it comes through bullying, a lot of it comes through what they see on social media, a lot of it's coming through drug addiction. And so I think we need to find a path forward to communicate with these kids in a way that they are able to understand so that this problem doesn't continue to get worse.
I mean, it's funny. My students, like when they come to me and say they have anxiety, I often say to them, of course you do. You're tested. Where else in life do you have a test? Do you have a 4-hour exam every week? Like, this is a ridiculous idea. But yeah.
Well, this has been awesome. I've enjoyed the conversation with you too. And it was cool to to chat all things mental health, all things DSM, all things like the path forward, because we're in this situation right now. And it just helps to just talk about these things and destigmatize it and hear stories like yours, Sarah, and get insights from people like you, Tom, to figure out like what's going on and how can we begin to address it in a different way so that the problem, again, gets better and not worse. So Sarah and Tom, if people want to connect with you, each of you, and they want to maybe buy your books or they want to follow you on social media, like where's the best place for them to do that?
Well, I've got a website, thomasinselmd.com, and I'm pretty easy to find with the same handle on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn.
My website is sarahfay.org. So it's sarahfay.org. And Pathological, the true story of 6 misdiagnoses, is on Amazon, or you can go to IndieBound if you want to support your local independent bookstore. And I also founded Pathological, the movement, and that's really getting at, it's a public awareness campaign to publicize, empower people to make knowledgeable and informed decisions about their mental health, and touching on a lot of what I talked about today and just trying to get this information to the public and correct a lot of the misinformation that's on the internet. And that is pathological.us.
Oh, that's great. Hey, I should also mention that, like Sarah, I use the proceeds of my book Healing to start a nonprofit, which is a news service. So it's called mindsightnews.org. Mindsight is MINDSITE news, and it's a nonprofit that's addressing all things mental health, but particularly the kind of intersection of mental health and social justice issues. And it's free, it's nonpartisan, and we're looking for content as well as for people to subscribe.
Amazing. So for those listening, be sure to check them out. I will be sure to plug their websites and their books in the show notes. And for those listening, what I invite you to do is to share a takeaway. Maybe it was something that Sarah said about her incredible journey and everything that she's overcome. And maybe it was something that she said about what she would have told her younger self or somebody going through that, or maybe it was just the wealth of knowledge and wisdom that Tom shared throughout our conversation on mental health, on depression, anxiety, all those things, and the path out. Maybe something that he said hit home with you. Anyway, be sure to tag him, tag Sarah, tag myself, because we'd love to hear your feedback. And we once again thank you for listening to this episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and we'll see you next time.